Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or morning, depending on which time zone you're in. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Guys. And I'm joined here by my friends Sean Johnston and Alan Jacobson. Sean in Montana, I think Yellowstone, and Alan right near the beaches. So I'm here in Kansas City and home of the Super Bowl Chiefs. So I'm glad to have you guys with us today. Today, we're going to talk about something that's like really affecting the real estate industry. And these effects are taking place officially on a national basis, August 17th, and some regions are a little bit sooner. But what these are the outcomes of the class action lawsuits that were filed in 2019, and the first case was heard and settled on a national basis and October ruled on in October of last year. And some of the ramifications that have occurred from that are actually kicking into gear on August 17th. So wanted to kind of give you a high level, and then Sean will give you a little bit more detail on that, and we'll talk through kind of the repercussions and some of the things we're going to be facing in this new market effective the 17th. So Sean, take it away.
Yeah, well, it's thanks, Alan or Trip. It's been quite a long time coming, as you guys know. Maybe our listeners aren't aware, but this has been in effect or happening for about 4 years. And like you were saying, we were just chatting with Alan this morning. Apparently, Florida is instigating everything the 1st of August rather than the 17th. Our state here in Montana was hoping to get everything instigated by the 15th of this month, but it looks like that's not going to happen until mid-August here as well, just because of the difficulty of getting everything out. But what we know is the what we call in our MLS the SOC, or selling office compensation, being offered by the listing agent brokerage is no longer going to be allowed to be offered within the MLS system. And really, the question mark at this point is, what are the ramifications of that to both buyers and sellers? And today, we could talk for hours on all the ins and outs of this, but today we're going to try to just focus on how does that affect you if you're going out to buy a home starting this next month, and what do you as a buyer need to be aware of? So there are three or four different issues. The first being right at the very beginning. I think the number one concern or change that we're going to see that most people aren't familiar with or used to doing is having a buyer representation agreement in place with the agent that is showing them homes or properties of any type. Alan, you want to jump in on that and talk about what that looks like and what the requirements are?
Sure. So let me clarify something a little bit. So those of you out there that are not quite as familiar with some of the terminology that we're talking about and what happens behind the scenes. So you know that there's the MLS, the multiple listing service, and that is where all realtors put their listings. And then those listings get picked up by Zillow, by Realtor.com, by Trulia, by Movado, different sites, and they just basically pick up the information. Now you don't get to see, as the consumer, the compensation, so you have no idea what an agent will make or not make until down the road, maybe even until you close on a property. Well, now that field, the agent compensation field on the MLS, will disappear. So the compensation then has to be worked out in a different way, because it's no longer one set number, one set percentage that goes to the buyer's agent. And in Florida, at least in where I am in Southeast Florida, I believe it's happening as of next week. That's what they told me when I called them. So at that point, agents, when they are looking, they are not going to see a commission. Okay, so now you, as the consumer, it's not been your concern in the past because you knew that agents were always getting paid. Well, now they may or may not. It all depends on what the seller wants, and it all depends on what you, as the buyer, work out. So the buyer broker agreement is the first step. And that is an agreement that you have to make with an agent, if you're going to work with an agent, even before they send you a listing from the MLS. They can't even do that anymore. So that agreement could be for one property, it could be for a town, it could be for a community, it could be for a county, it could be for a month, it could be for 4 months, whatever you decide with your agent, you set the parameters. And then with that, then there's the compensation, which I'll let Tripp take over on that.
Yeah, so great background there, Sean and Alan. And as to the compensation, I think that's probably one of the biggest catalysts for change here in this whole process. Traditionally, and to add a little bit more, traditionally, that compensation, most of the time, not all the time, was factored into the sell side of the equation, paying the compensation for both the listing agent and the buying agent. And what's going away is that compensation is now no longer to be an option in the MLS for the seller to pay for the buyer's agent. So that's being totally separated. And so as we kind of talk about compensation going forward, there are going to be several ways that buyer's agents can still get paid. Obviously, no one wants to work for free, nor should they. And buyer's agents work very, very hard. And we all three here of us, not only do listings, but we do buyers, help buyers as well. So several ways to get paid. And I'll speak to kind of the traditional and hand it over to Sean for the lending side. But the easiest way, and I say easiest in terms of laying out contractually, is that the buyer's agent merely gets paid by the buyer themselves. Now, contractually, I said, realistically, that may be the most cumbersome way for some buyers because that's an out-of-pocket expense in addition to closing costs, appraisal fees, lender fees, etc. And that could become onerous to a buyer just from a total cash out-of-pocket expenditure. The second way that it can be done is the buyer's agent can seek concessions from the seller in the form of a credit or in the form of seller paid closing costs that can be applied to the buyer's agent commission. Now, none of that can be advertised. That's one of the new rules. So that will be a negotiation will come out in discussions between agents and buyers and sellers and their clients. But that will be a fully negotiated item that will be spelled out, and often in many cases, that seller, will have the opportunity to, consider paying a concession or not. So those are the new rules, where it used to be that even though they didn't have the responsibility to pay the buyer's agent commission, in all practicality, most of the time they did. And now it's not an option to see that, at least visibly. So there will be a bilateral discussion about that in many cases. The third way is on the lending side. And Sean, I'll flip that over to you. You have a bit of information on that.
Yeah. Again, it kind of piggybacks off of what Tripp just said, and that's that when you negotiate a contract with a seller, you have the one of many options. But when it comes to the cost of purchasing a home, in fact, I have 2 contracts that I'm working through right now, both of which where the buyer has asked for the seller to help them with their closing costs. Very common, especially on the lower cost homes, first-time home buyers and that kind of thing. Like Trick was saying, you also have the ability in that same line, if you choose, to just ask for seller concessions to include covering the either all or some portion of the buyer's agent's compensation, again, to help that buyer with the cost of getting the house purchased. That has been a challenge in the past with lending, in that there are limitations to how much sellers are allowed to offer in the form of concessions, depending on the type of loan, whether it's a conventional loan, an FHA loan, or VA loan. 2, 4, and 6% based on dollar figures. It's fairly complicated. We don't need to get into it now. However, a couple of months ago, as this started to come to fruition, both Freddie and Fannie, as well as the VA, sat down and came up with solutions and said that they would now allow those concessions from a seller to a buyer's agent without impacting those percentages. So previously, it was not even legal for, within the VA system, for a buyer's agent to be compensated from the buyer at all, which is, without getting on a soapbox, in my opinion, part of what created these problems. But the reality is they've fixed those things in the background. They're not permanent fixes. They were temporary arrangements that each of the major lending systems have put in place, that they're working through making permanent over time. So there are a lot of ways to go about it. And I just want to go back really quickly and say, the simplest, like Tripp was saying, we have for years, my team here in Montana had conversations with buyers right up front and let them know this, we're going to provide services to you. These are the services we provide, and these are the professional fees that we charge to provide those services. And then, in most cases, or in many cases, a substantial portion or all of those fees will be able to be covered by the seller, the person listing their property for sale. And that's not necessarily not true anymore. It's just that it can't be handled or offered in any way from one broker to another inside the MLS. It can, however, be negotiated between the buyer and the seller with the buy-sell agreement that we put together. And so things are going to change, and yet in some ways they're going to be the same. They're just going to be approached in a different format. It's going to require a lot more communication at the front end. And going back to what Alan was saying on the what we used to call buyer broker, which is now the buyer representation agreement, you'll have the opportunity to have that conversation with your agent on the buy side as to what their normal fee is. And then they will, hopefully, if they're well educated in this arena, be able to talk through the different ways that that compensation can be addressed, both between buyer's agent and buyer, and the seller themselves as well. So I hope this is a fairly complex situation that's going to change virtually overnight. And my concern, or what I've been seeing in my particular market, is unfortunately a lack of understanding within our profession as to how these things are actually going to need to be addressed in just a couple more weeks. And so finding an agent who's capable of, in relatively simple terms, explaining how this process is going to work going forward is going to be very, very important if you're a buyer.
So I'd like to kind of simplify it a little bit, what was and what will be. In the past, it was very easy for agents because there was compensation in the MLS, or there still is until that comes off the MLS. It was very easy for agents to look at homes. Let's say you say, I want to live in this community or this area, and I'm looking at this price range, these kind of homes, blah, blah, blah. Okay. It was very easy for agents to look at the different homes and pick and choose which ones they wanted to take you to based on the commission. So if it was a 2% that was being offered, and a 2.5% and a 3%, it was very easy for them. You had no way of knowing because it's not on Zillow, it's not on Realtor.com, but it is in the MLS. It was very easy for them to just pick out the 3% ones. And you may not have seen the best homes that were available to you for what you were looking for based on your parameters. So the good that's coming out of this is that by signing these agreements with buyer representation, they're obligated to show any home, provided it's available, any home that you ask them to show. They can't pick and choose anymore. So yes, it may sound difficult that if you don't necessarily have the money to pay extra, for commission, if it can't be negotiated with the seller, because that's a possibility. So there are a lot of angles that you have to look at, but the real positive is that now they're really working harder for you. That's how I look at it. What do you guys think?
Well, the only thing I would disagree with is as a buyer, you do have the ability to see the compensation on Zillow. I'm not sure if you can see it on all websites, but Zillow does require that it's available, and you'll see it,
I'll
or
do
at
that.
least
Okay.
you can see it now. If you scroll down through the finance portion of it, it's been honestly to me a problem. Exactly what you were saying, Alan. Number one, that's an agreement between the listing agent and their seller. So to me, that was never something that should have been in the public space to start with. And I think that I'm in agreement with you that I think the concern, and part of the reason that this whole lawsuit came down, was the concern for what we call steering. And I'm not sure whether this will fix that or not, to be honest. It may actually create additional issues with regard to that. That's for a whole nother conversation on a different day. We could talk for an hour just about that particular issue alone, I think. But we are coming up against our 20 minutes. And so
See how easy that was?
any final thoughts on this, Trip?
Yeah, I
Alan?
just wanted to add, for context's sake, kind of the premise of the lawsuit that was filed early on was that basically the question at hand was, why should a seller pay compensation to a buyer's agent without actually receiving representation from that buyer's agent? Their representation is with the listing agent. And so the lawsuit that was actually won was to separate those two. And I think we've been kind of clear on that point. The new world that we're going to be living in, one factor that no one has been able to measure, nor do many people talk about, is what I term the liquidity factor. In other words, how easy is it to go see a home in this new world for a buyer? And a good agent is going to make that process seamless for you. They're going to work a lot harder to get you into homes because they're going to have a lot more discussions about this topic alone. And they're also going to be scheduling more hours, that's okay, as long as it benefits the buyer. The concern is when the agent is not adept and not understanding these rules and tries to operate from the old paradigm, that could be problematic for the buyer. So I think, one of the other good things that comes out of this new approach is that buyers will actually get to interview buyers' agents to assess for, depth of knowledge, understanding of the environment, negotiation skills, value propositions. And that's a positive. That will elevate the industry, in my opinion. And I think we'll all be better off. Now, the liquidity factor will get, also my opinion, will get rectified over time. At the beginning, it will be a little tumultuous, but the industry will adapt. You will find that very astute agents will be doing the bulk of the business, just like now. And at the end of the day, the goal is for both buyers and sellers to be positively impacted. But there will be a period of change in which everyone's adapting.
Yeah, very well
100%.
said, Trip. I appreciate that. And by the way, Alan, oh, sorry, bumped my computer there. Bye. I just looked up on Zillow. They've always, for the last, I think, 2 years, they've had the compensation for the buyer, and they have now removed that.
Interesting.
So I just looked at it a
Wow.
week or two ago, and it was still there. So, these things are happening very quickly. They are going to have an impact. And I think, again, going to what Trip was saying, I really want to drive this point home. It's been, I think, a frustration in our industry, both from the consumer side as well as from the professional side. And that's that the outcome of this will be the agents, the real estate professionals that are in fact professionals that do this full time, that take this industry very, very seriously, and the service that they provide to their clients very seriously, will still be here providing that same service. And honestly, I think, on our team, I feel like it's helping us even step up how we're doing particular pieces of the puzzle, because we're going back and reevaluating the process ourselves to make sure that we're doing everything we can to provide the highest level of service possible. So you're also going to see a lot, try to be a prophet here for a second, but I have a feeling you're going to see a lot of people that have real estate license, likely not have a real estate license in the next year, because it is going to become a more complex and a more difficult business to be a part of. So,
Well,
and
I
that's
think,
a good thing for the industry.
yeah, I think one thing we should talk about, not now, but kind of extrapolate on more, is what is it going to be like for buyers if they opt to not work with an agent? What are they going to have to do? How are they going to have to work? How are they going to be able to get in to see homes? That's something that's really, really, I think it's something that a lot of buyers don't really think about. Are they going to go to open houses? How many open houses are there going to be? Are lock boxes still going to be a thing or not? So I think that's something we should, talk about, so they're informed.
Yeah, so really, really great question. And so everybody, this is a very exciting time in real estate. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of change going on. And so if you have further questions about any of what we've talked about today, or we didn't have time to get into the seller side, so next week we will jump into the impacts of these new rules on the seller side of transactions, and maybe talk some more about the buyer, what Alan was just talking about with regards to what if you wanted to just go forth and purchase a home without agent representation as a buyer. Stay informed, reach out to any one of the three of us through Facebook, YouTube, comment, like, share, subscribe, all those fun things. You doing that helps us be able to continue to put out these videos and answer the difficult questions for people. And so we really appreciate everybody. And with no further ado, I guess we'll just see you guys next week.
Absolutely. Have a great week, all.